Hello everyone and welcome to Hermes XM Services. Today I'm going to talk about FOB, which is the last Incoterm in Group F. Let's get started.
In FOB, the seller must provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity with the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity that may be required by the contract. The buyer must pay the price of the goods as provided in the contract of sale. The seller must deliver the goods by placing them on board the vessel nominated by the buyer at the loading point, if any, indicated by the buyer at the named port of shipment. The seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or at the time within the agreed period notified by the buyer. If no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period and in the manner customary at the port. If no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits his purpose. The buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered.
In FOB, the seller bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods until they have been delivered, and the buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the time they have been delivered. If the buyer fails to give notice or the vessel nominated by the buyer fails to arrive on time or fails to take the goods or closes the cargo earlier than the time notified, then the buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the agreed date, and in the absence of an agreed date, from the date selected by the buyer. And if no such date has been notified, from the end of the agreed period for delivery, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods.
Under FOB, the seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of carriage. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost with any information in the possession of the seller, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs for arranging carriage. If agreed, the seller must contract for carriage on the usual terms at the buyer's risk and cost. The seller must comply with any transport-related security requirements up to delivery. The buyer must contract or arrange at his own cost for the carriage of the goods from the named port of shipment, except when the contract of the carriage is made by the seller. Under FOB, the seller must provide the buyer at the seller's cost with the usual proof that the goods have been delivered. Unless such proof is a transport document, the seller must provide assistance to the buyer at the buyer's request, risk and cost in obtaining a transport document. The buyer must accept the proof of delivery provided by the seller. Trading under FOB, where applicable, the seller must carry out and pay for all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as export license, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization. Where applicable, the seller must assist the buyer at the buyer's request, risk and cost in obtaining any documents or information related to all transit or import clearance formalities, including security requirements and pre-shipment inspection needed by the country of transit or the country of import. Under FOB, where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk, and cost in obtaining any documents or information related to all export clearance formalities, including security requirements and pre-shipment inspection needed by the country of export. Where applicable, the buyer must also carry out and pay for all formalities required by any country of transit and the country of import, such as import license, any license required for transit, security clearance for import and any transit, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization.
If you find this kind of video helpful in your international trading career, give this video a like and remember to subscribe the channel to see the later videos.
The seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost, with information in the possession of the seller that the buyer needs for obtaining insurance. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to make a contract of insurance. Under FOB, the seller must pay the costs of those checking operations such as checking quality, measuring, weighing, and counting that are necessary for the purpose of delivering the goods. The seller must, at his own cost, package the goods, unless it is usual for the particular trade to transport the type of goods sold unpackaged. The seller must package and mark the goods in the manner appropriate for their transport, unless the parties have agreed on specific packaging or marking requirements. The buyer has no obligation to the seller. Under FOB, the seller must pay all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered, other than those payable by the buyer. The seller must pay the costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer that the goods have been delivered. Where applicable, the seller must pay duties, taxes, and any other costs related to export clearance. The seller must also pay the buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information. The buyer must pay all costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered, other than those payable by the seller. The buyer must pay the seller for all costs and charges related to providing assistance in obtaining documents and information. Where applicable, the buyer must pay duties, taxes, and any other costs related to transit or import clearance. The buyer must also pay any additional costs incurred, either because the buyer has failed to give notice or the vessel nominated by the buyer fails to arrive on time, fails to take the goods, or closes cargo earlier than the time notified, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. Trading under FOB, the seller must give the buyer sufficient notice either that the goods have been delivered or that the vessel has failed to take the goods within the time agreed. The buyer must give the seller sufficient notice of any transport-related security requirements, the vessel name, loading point, and if any, the selected delivery date within the agreed period.